welcome to a very special event that I think is very close to many of our hearts. The title of the event is What Does Palestine Reveal About the Psy-disciplines? There's closed captioning on. I think you should be able to turn that off if you like. And we also have really fantastic BSL interpretation. I I'm flagging that right now, but I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our interpreters in a second. As for myself, my name is Tarek Younis. I am the racial justice researcher at Healing Justice London. I've been writing and researching and teaching on the racism and politics of psychology for many years. And as some of you may know, I've recently launched a Palestine project under the umbrella of Healing Justice London to explore actually what Palestine is really revealing about British mental health settings and the politics of British mental health settings. With me is I'm very honored to have our fantastic guests. We have Professor Lara Sheehi, who's an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. And she's the founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis in the Arab World Lab. Laura's work takes up decolonial and anti-oppressive approaches to psychoanalysis with a focus on liberation struggles in the Global South. She's co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which was published by Routledge in 2022. For everyone logging in, this is a book you have to check out. It's actually also going to be something we're going to address during the talk today. We also have with me a really inspiring anti-racist psychiatrist based in London, Mashal Iftikhar, who's going to be moderating and sharing our discussion after Laura and I speak. Also with us are two really amazing BSL interpreters. You can see the option for everyone joining in. There should be a interpreter option at the very bottom, which you can click, and you will see and meet Sumaya and Petra, who are two really inspiring interpreters who've taught me actually also, I think, over the year how to speak, I think, not too fast and maybe not too slow, I guess, but to speak clearly. And I've really appreciated so much of the work that they've done, and we're always honored to have our Sumaya and Petra join us for any of our events. So just maybe to quickly introduce a few things. First of all, welcome everyone to Healing Justice London. Healing Justice London takes the significance and development of transformative healing structures. Sorry, let me repeat myself. We give significance to transformative healing structures in our collective effort towards liberation. You can check out our website. The logo I see right now, actually, that we have up is an old logo, so I might actually get reprimanded for that. But if you go on our website, you can see we have an amazing set of programming to support the process of our collective liberation, like our breath circles that we have on Wednesdays. And in fact, we just also launched our online In Practice magazine with a very relevant article that was recently published called Fettet Adas During Genocide. And I highly encourage everyone to just check out our new website and let us know what you think. We also have many amazing people who supported this event. You can't see them, but I want to give a shout out especially to everyone at Healing Justice London. We've had Alex on comms and others, many people who are just working in the background. And I just want to give a deep thanks and gratitude to everybody at Healing Justice London for supporting this event. We also have some community agreements that we always work with. And I just want to set out, we're not going to go through all of it, But in principle, we like to practice and rehearse thinking about um, what it means to be community and how we rehearse and practice maybe some ideas of community. And I think maybe the one I'll focus on just for right now is the one on lived experience, that these are not just conversations. Everything we're talking about are visceral, tangible, and material. It impacts us on many levels. And to this, what I encourage everyone to do for this webinar, given that we will be speaking to some heavy subjects, of course, is to listen to what your body needs. And you can opt in and opt out at any point in time. Take time, you can hydrate, you can also rest where possible. And I can assure you that, in fact, one of the things that I'm doing in this respect is also recording. So if anybody feels the need to be like, I think I need to opt out just for now, you can reach recording at a later date. Okay. Um, and so for the program for today is as follows. Lara and I are going to engage in a conversation, which will last maybe up until 9 p.m. UK time. That's going to be followed by just a short break. I know people don't like to take breaks during webinars just in case they feel like they might miss something. So we want to schedule in just a short break, just so people can maybe move around without feeling like they're going to miss anything. And then that's going to be followed by Q&A with discussion and questions from the public. I need to mention right now, we're doing comments and questions only by writing because they will have to be filtered and kind of digested by Michelle first, who's going to support us with that. We will not have a dedicated online space or breakout room for tonight. As I was mentioning, please attend this webinar to the best of to whatever capacity you're bringing into the webinar tonight. However, I want you to let you know we do have something called an aftercare menu where we offer support links and obviously spaces that we provide at Healing Justice London. And you can access that via the email on your screen, or you just go on our website and you can look at our aftercare menu there. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. And I just wanted to begin by bearing witness. And I think that's something that we can't understate. We're bearing witness to the genocide that's unfolding before our eyes. That's on the tail end of 100+ years of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And in particular, we, in our memorialization, we remember names. We remember that every single life lost was an entire life, was an entire world. I always recall our daughter, Hind, and her story the vehicle that she and her uncle's family were in was shot by the IDF. And then as everyone around her had passed away and she was waiting for the ambulance to arrive, and we're all bearing witness to this. The ambulance arrived only to be shelled by the IDF, and she passed away alone in the vehicle. So we remember these people in our hearts because they're ours. And we exalt those who resist settler-colonial projects all over the world. And we pray we are forgiven for any cowardice we might harbor for not resisting in whatever capacity we could have. And so to begin with that, I just want to emphasize that the purpose of today's webinar is not to look at what's happening at Palestine directly, not as a form of erasure, but as a form of a continuation and thinking a little bit more about unpacking the boundaries that's separating what's happening over there to what's happening here. I think there's a great deal of emphasis, as we can see for many of us, to ask questions about what we as mental health professionals can do to stop the violence and the genocide in Palestine. And I'm not here to dismiss the importance of those questions. But just as Palestine has been quite revealing about the nature of white supremacy for last year, the purpose of this event today is to really take stock of what Palestine has revealed about the politics of our psy-disciplines, our mental health institutions, our mental health settings. And to this, I'm mindful and to bring in Laura into the conversation now. Um, so I've been reading your work, Laura, and the first time I heard you speak live, I've heard you speak before on podcasts and things like that, but the first time I heard you speak live was at the Freud Museum. And I had logged in and, expecting a really fantastic discussion. And I was surprised by, I think, by how it started, where one of your co-panelists started by stating that we're not terrorists, right? For yourselves and everyone on the panel. I'm wondering if we can potentially begin by affirming the resistance, by affirming a resistance, by resisting the racial politics of condemnation. But I'm wondering actually if we can start with that experience. How did that, what did that mean to you, for you? You came and you were speaking at the Freud Museum to sort of start with a statement of condemnation.
Yeah. Thank you, Tarek, first of all, for having me and for Healing Justice London, and of course to Masha and our BSL interpreters. So much labor goes into these things. So I want to start there because I think the less savory parts of what Palestine has taught us about, or perhaps not just revealed, but maybe just brought into high contrast, right? And focus is things many of us have already known about the psy-disciplines. But the beautiful part of it too is getting to have like a network of solidarity that this is a part of. So you reaching out and us being able to do this is also another piece of what Palestine reveals to us, is that unlike what the settler-colonial apartheid regime wants us to believe, we are not fringe. There are many of us. There's almost 300 people on this call today and many, many, many more. And so I kind of just want to start there. And maybe that's also the parallel to the Freud Museum event. Um, so let's locate ourselves. There's March of this year, and the Red Clinic in the UK had rented out a space at the Freud Museum to do this event. And we were talking about psychoanalysis under occupation, our book, um, and all of a sudden, a day before the event, we get an email from the Freud Museum saying, I think we have to cancel this event. And we know this. You and I know what this means. So immediately you're sort of like, um, what's happening? Of course, there's sort of, some sort of secrecy around it, which is a parallel also to how the settler state works. They work with secret information. And so you're already primed. Whenever there's like secret information, somebody has brought a complaint. We already know what that means. And at the time we got this email, we actually didn't know who it was that was making the complaint, but it was revealed that it was UK Lawyers for Israel. And for those of you who are tuning in, you might know that they are best known for prior to October 7th, because that is not the starting point of time. They had artwork done by children from Gaza, taken down from a hospital in the UK, from a complaint that said that it made patients uncomfortable. And afterwards, after a freedom of information request was made, it was found out that the person who was made uncomfortable is one of the lawyers from UK Lawyers for Israel. So it shows you the sort of foreclosed loop that this has, the creation, the manufacturing of, crisis that ends up needing an intervention and ends up being actually the group. And so the same sort of thing, this is the group that came after this. And they were really actually, they published a piece about me saying, a terrorist supporter is going to be speaking at the Freud Museum, and then wrote the Freud Museum and threatened them to take this up to the High Commissioner of anti-terrorism in the UK. And that's where it starts, right? And so we had a decision, like you're saying, yes, of course, we're not here to qualify these specious claims, or to say that we have to disidentify from uh, racist sort of accusations as a starting point of our being, but rather to also make sure that abusers don't get to function in secret, right? Is that in what, who else would be asked to confirm that they are not going to commit a terrorism? This was an actual sentence, right? As a starting point. And worse, I think this is the piece that, like, sometimes I think we're pulled in to make these compromises, not because we think they're made in good faith, but to be able to let something happen, right? This is important. We need to let it happen. We had contingency plans because this is how it goes, especially in today's world. But worse than that, it wasn't just you have to tell us and make sure and sign a statement to the Freud Museum telling us you will not commit terroristic acts or support terrorism. But more so, they wanted the names of every single registered person. And that's the piece you start to come in is like, if we were in the habit of handing over every single, I mean, this is the level of surveillance we're talking about. And that was sort of to deregularize and denormalize these demands that places can make. This wasn't even the Freud Museum that was asking this. This was UK Lawyers for Israel asking the Freud Museum, who then wants to sort of make sure they're within policy without even checking that, and asks us as a contingency, you are not allowed to use this space unless you do this and unless you also I think don't record or something like that. I think those were the three things. And so, but that's the place of refusal. The refusal is absolutely not, you will not be getting any names of people. What other event have you asked from a rented place? Where this is a contractual piece, we're renting this place. What other in what other event do you ask for people's names? And also, how do we have any assurances about where those names go? That's the level. I'm saying this to this degree of detail because that's the level that we are dealing with here. The level of intrusion, the level of psychic intrusions, the level of fear mongering, and the level of surveillance. It's very clear. This is not even like veiled, right? This is, you are terrorists. We have to pay more attention, and therefore we need everybody who might be actually associated with you. And of course, we said no to all of those things.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Lara. I mean, I think the thing that really strikes me sometimes that's missing from the conversation is how much all of this follows clearly in the trajectory of the war on terror, right? And I think there's something here that I really feel like comes that I'd like to address actually. And you speak to this in your book when we speak about mental health settings. You know, I really want to open up this topic because what I'm hearing a lot from mental health professionals in a way is like, can we have uh, space? Can we have some dialogue, right? So they feel censored, they feel they're self-censoring. But there's something here that's very particular about the war on terror that showcases the material conditions it's not only immaterial, right? So it's not just about, oh, I might say something wrong and people might not like me, but material conditions insofar as that it's embedded within a security state that
Mhm.
potentially taking a position around Palestine has actual material consequences for people for potentially supporting any forms of resistance movements, etc. Right? So there's this uneven ground that already begins, and this is well embedded within sort of the field and history of counterterrorism. You know, I
Mhm.
know Lisa Semnitsky, she mentions in her book Disciplining Terror, you know, just in the history and the development of contemporary terrorism studies, that attacks from coming from Palestinians on Israeli soil were recorded in databases as terrorist attacks. But any
Mhm.
attacks from Israelis on Palestinian lands were not, right? So even in the construction the history of the construction of terrorism has always been one that's incredibly racist,
Mm-hmm.
and one that particularly focuses on Palestine and Palestinian resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're drawing on decades and decades and decades of that history, right? And now there's this notion of um, maybe as psychologists, as mental health professionals, we need to be able to establish a safe space of
Mm-hmm.
dialogue
Mm-hmm.
with, kind of in a way, knowing this fact that actually the four walls that are around us do not kind of create that safe space in the first place because these
Mm-hmm.
security policies are around us. I'm you because you mentioned this in your book, and I wanted to actually come maybe a little bit later to this because I feel like we're speaking to that right now. So there's
Yeah.
something clearly about the Freud Museum event in itself being a not safe space. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you that directly. Did you feel that was a safe space for yourself and for others to be able to talk about this, to talk about?
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I think this is what you're sort of getting at is that the idea that somehow there are safe spaces within a security state or a settler colony is because the purview or the structures of the idea of what safety constitutes, it's already set up for us. So even in the conversation of like, as you were saying, like, Palestinians on Israeli land, like the fact that there's categories that inherently constitutively erase the fact that from the river to the sea, it's Palestine. And the categories can come up, and then those categories can then have values. So that in this direction, it's terrorism. In this direction, it's nothing. But the direction is a totality that is Palestine, right? So I'm being very specific about that because the construct of how we even talk about this or conceptualize these spaces are also within frameworks that orient us in a particular direction. And that's the construction of the myth of safety for some people and not for others that are based on, of course, nation state borders and all the rest that comes with that. So to localize this now in the Freud Museum, is there, I mean, there's an irony there, right? There's a reason why we actually wanted to do it in the Freud Museum. The book is called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. Psychoanalysis needs to be expansive enough to be able to hold Palestine without imploding on itself, right? And at the same time, we can understand and see and have tracked how that can't hold up. It cannot cash out on its promises. So here was an opportunity for us to be like, this is playing out right in front of your eyes here. How many events happen at the Freud Museum? And how many events have ever had a threat of a report to the High Commissioner? That in and of itself tells us something. If we're thinking symptomatically, if we're thinking psychoanalytically, if we're thinking symbolically, we're thinking materially. I can go through all the levels of thinking and feeling here. Something different happened with the mention of Palestine. Something different happened when people, myself, my partner, and the other speaker who was with us, Nader Sharhoub and Stephen, all of us were speaking. There's something that shifted because all of us are known for our explicit support for Palestine and for Palestinian liberation. There is no two ways around it, right? And so I don't think we even had an expectation of safety under the illusion of safety because the psy-disciplines and places like the Freud Museum have never offered us that safety. That is to the contrary. But it is about us saying, if you are going to include us in particular ways, we will also make sure that space is taken up and that Palestine will have a place to be spoken everywhere. We are not going to engage in the politics of silencing any erasure. And if you can't hold that, then there's another conversation to be had, right? In this case, it happened to go in this direction because I think it honestly ended up being a game of chicken. And at the end, the timing was such that there were some folks within the Freud Museum who were pushing for it to happen. There were others that didn't. And let's say reason won out. I'm actually not sure it was reason that won, but I think I stay away from these ideas of safe spaces if we're going to have a parallel to what we've been seeing happening, certainly in the past year and some, but also in the history of psychology, is that it's primed to create safe spaces for some people and under the guise of universality and constitutively write out other people out of even the conception or dignity of safety too. So there's a way in which we divest from even the idea of that this is going to be safety. It's not our support and our speaking about Palestine and our alignment with Palestinian liberation is never contingent on safety materially or otherwise.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Laura. I mean, my head is running, 100 miles a minute at this point. I mean, there's so many things that you are raising that I think is touching myself. I mean, I think many people feel the same way. I'm just going to draw on some themes because I think I want to put some themes on the table to make sure that we don't
Yeah.
we don't miss them. I just want to validate actually just one point. I think this comes up in the chapter of your book, but not to really unpack that. I'm just kind of validating how the point of dialogue and safe space, or I mean, I don't know if safe space was really the words used, but really that
Yeah.
the practice of dialogue and the way that kind of developed in the last 2, 3 decades post Oslo. And you mentioned in your book, and I think it starts that chapter on that it starts with Dr. Sameh Jaber
Mhm.
coming together with Israelis who, speak about the necessity of having that space for everyone to come together and to talk. And she has such a fantastic quote that you have in the book where she was speaking about, she said, the more Israelis breathe, the more Palestinians choke. And I think there's
Mhm.
something here about actually how the very notion of that shared space in its erasure of these power dynamics, right? In its erasure of the fact that this is a settler colonial project, there's a very clear power hierarchy here. So
Mhm.
the very breath, the very breathing of power in fact sucks out the air from the colonized. And I
Mhm.
thought that was such a powerful expression. So I just wanted
Mhm.
to just point that and maybe just to reference your book. I think the more I can inspire people to read your book, the better. Let me just point out because I think there's so much about that your story that's really, really revealing. And anyone who knows me knows I'm a really big proponent of we only really need one person's story to make sense of everything that's happening. I think that's very clear over the years. Certain people's experiences can be quite revealing about the racial politics of our institutions, our disciplines. And certainly you are very, very much at the heart of that. I've learned a lot from your experience. I've learned a lot from your writings, but I've also learned a lot from your experiences. And I really wanted to value your presence for that as well. Um, so some of the themes that we want to raise, and I think in a way, I'm trying to hold to heart many conversations I've been having with mental health professionals, over the last year and many years before that. One is sort of about like this sort of presumed apolitical nature of, psychology therapy. We're not supposed to be political. And
Mhm.
we see how your experience really disrupts that, right? Because we see how incredibly violent the actual sort of disciplinary nature of the politics of like mental health settings or mental health institutions can really be. So a question I really want to bring up is one, the location of politics, right? And
Mhm.
sort of how erasure of politics from the side disciplines, from mental health settings, might potentially reify and reproduce the status quo and power
Mhm.
hierarchies.
Mhm.
You mentioned psychological safety, which I really wanted to get to. Um, I'm mindful of time insofar as I would have loved to maybe give you like 3 hours to share like your whole story, your whole the whole experience. I know you won't be able to go through that. I don't want to put that on you because I know you're already very tired.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm mindful that the there was a letter written against you. Um, and it spoke about making Jewish students feel unsafe. And there's this element of psychological safety that keeps reappearing, actually, not necessarily just in the sense of safe and unsafe, but actually particularly within a language, a vernacular of mental health, of like
Hmm.
psychological
Hmm.
safety, right?
Hmm.
And so there's this notion of, oh, can I speak of genocide without
Hmm. Hmm.
potentially
Hmm.
making people feel psychologically unsafe, potentially my
Hmm.
colleagues, my patients?
Hmm. Hmm.
And all of this sort of leads us to actually what is sort of, if we're recognizing that you had a very incredibly racist experience, what has the liberal acceptability of Zionism in our institutions really revealed about racism, actually? Like, what
Yeah,
is going on in our institutions that
right,
it's allowed for this? Um,
right.
So we could draw it back. You could start wherever you want. I'm happy
It's
to
a
also
lot.
keep
Yeah,
engaging in
yeah.
the conversation. We might not be
No.
able to cover all of that, but I think there's already a lot from what you were saying that I feel like people
Yes.
feel they're experiencing, but I think you're doing really
Sure.
you're so good at sort of vocalizing it.
Sure. And I'm never too tired for this, by the way, Tarek. This is the life-sustaining parts of this, right? Is for us to connect, for us to have public-facing conversations around this, to demystify the process, to make sure that people don't feel as systems of oppression intend us to feel, which is atomized. It's like my story is the story of 1,000 others before me. And the way it shook out was that it happened to, become something larger, which is the dream of these targeted campaigns, right? They target so many people, people that we don't end up even hearing about because these people either leave or stay silent because they're afraid or whatever versions of it. But they astroturf people with the intention of harming them and with the intention and the hope that this is going to become something larger, right? Um, so I'm never too tired to speak to that because I think it's less about individualizing it and more about speaking to a logic that has repeated itself over and over and over again. I mean, you write about the racialization of risk, right? And we can talk about that in terms of like who's more likely to be seen as a risk. But we can also think about how Fanon has talked about the racial allocation of guilt, that immediately when we speak as racialized subjects, that we are assumed guilty already, that there's a way in which that comes with racial hierarchy, that we are going to have to defend and prove ourselves 1,000 times over. Where, as we see right now, we have so-called colleagues who are making genocidal statements publicly with no repercussions. That becomes the norm. And it's actually a psychic inversion that happens. And we're the ones who are having to sort of prove ourselves. So this might get to your question about the idea of like a lack of politics. um, I think one thing this past year has shown everybody is that it's not that there aren't politics, it's that there are certain politics that are thought to be norms and acceptable, and anything that runs counter to that, counter to hegemony, counter to the norm, it's you are not supposed to be political in a specific direction. It's not all politics because the things we have seen in response, which gets into the campaign against me, was that there were no qualms about being political in the direction of disappearing the Arab woman explicitly, and disappearing the Arab woman with explicit intent, as though if I just disappeared, anti-Semitism would also disappear. This was made explicit.
Mm.
That's a political statement,
Yeah.
right? That direction is acceptable, partially because of what you know from your work, is that it has traction because of the security state, because of the war on terror, because decades of dehumanization of Muslims and Arabs, decades and centuries of racial capitalism. That is why it has traction. So in many ways, the politics look like they're seamless because they match and fall in line, in lockstep with the state line. There's no disruption to business as usual. But when those of us who come in and say, I refuse to have this be seamless, I insist on naming the violence that is happening. I insist on speaking, just as you did, the names of people who have been aggressed upon, the violence that is happening in our space, not just over there, not just in, like, every liberal in psychology is happy to get behind not having psychologists in Guantanamo Bay, for example. That's easy to be like, oh, I'm against torture, even though there were plenty that did not have that stance, right? But it becomes a little bit more glaring when it's in the room, right? And the ferocity of racism that was so easily reached to. I mean, you just have to scratch the surface. It was like, not only am I a terrorist, I'm an Arab Goebbels, I'm an Ayatollahist, I am a Malik, which has a particular resonance when we think about the genocidal statements that apartheid Zionist state has said to support its extermination campaign against Palestinians in Gaza, right? Meaning I deserve to die and be murdered, actually. I should be exterminated, right? Of course, I'm a Hamas agent, I'm a Hezbollah agent. They're laughable in terms of like their audacity of how available these tropes are, but they're available for all the reasons, all the infrastructure we're talking about. And then I think there's another layer to it, is that from there, it was, she's anti-American, she's a communist, and you start to see the logic. And that's the part I think we're talking about, is that is a political statement. To be anti-communist, to be pro-capitalist, to be pro-imperialist, to be okay with the genocidal state, to be fine with the racism of cops in the heart of empire or in the UK. Those are normative positions. Those can be sold as non-political. But if anything contends that somehow is marked as political, right? And I think that's what Samah was getting at when she says, for every time an Israeli breathes, a Palestinian chokes. It's a logic that is built on a hierarchy in which there is no space for both to exist. For a settler to be there, the indigenous must be murdered. There is no space for both to happen. So I think the parallel in our disciplines is, for normative politics to be seamless, dissidents cannot exist. People who speak out loud and say and talk about the hypocrisy and name the logic and say you cannot at once claim liberalism and then also treat racial minorities in this way. You cannot say you are feminist and then not care about, an Arab woman being pilloried and having threats of sexual violence on listservs against me. You cannot say you're both those. These things are incompatible. For one to exist, the other must disappear. Right? And I think this is I suppose I keep going back to the logic that's just been uncovered. It's a logic that racialized people the world over have known for a long time. And certainly Palestinians have told us forever. And now it's just so obvious and so plain, in plain sight. That's what I mean by scratching the surface. You don't have to do very much. You say Arab, you say woman, you say Palestine in the same breath. And you say this person believes in Palestinian liberation, the machine does the work for you.
Yeah. I think, I mean, drawing on Fanon, one thing that really comes also from that you're saying, because it really just takes one person to reveal all this. My interpretation of Fanon's idea of sociogenesis is just the idea that, we have such an impulse in psychology and mental health professions to diagnose and pathologize people and kind of depoliticize their context, right? So
Mhm.
people might be experiencing poverty and they might, because of that, actually feel a lot of anxiety and things like that. And that's sort of the pathologizing, but equally the depoliticizing impulse that the professions have. For me, what Fanon really shows is actually how we can invert that. In fact, that we can use one person actually to actually diagnose the political climate that we're in. And I think we have to think about this much more in terms of like the experiences that people are going through. What
Mhm.
is it actually revealing about the systems that we're in? The systems are
Mhm.
working
Mhm.
exactly as they are meant to be working, and we can
Mhm.
diagnose the political climate. And I wanted I was going to push back if maybe mental health professionals might say they don't want people in Guantanamo, but I think they might potentially
That's
be
what I'm
quite
saying.
happy.
Yeah,
Yeah, they might be quite
exactly.
happy. I mean, I've had when I was researching how mental health professionals are kind of accepting the role of policing in British mental health setting,
Yes.
they have to
Hmm.
um under the prevent policy, it's a policy where they have to identify and report individuals they suspect might be susceptible to radicalization and becoming terrorists in the future, like Tom Cruise, not Tom Cruise being a terrorist, Tom Cruise being in Minority Report and trying to figure out what people are going to do in the
Yeah.
future. Um, it's interesting to me, one case study that comes up to mind is how someone pushed back against like why are we as mental health professionals, why are we doing this? Like, why are we getting counterterrorism training? And why are we
Hmm.
being asked to like fulfill these
Hmm.
responsibilities? And someone else turned to them and screamed, "We're just trying to save lives." And in that, we
Yes.
see actually how incredibly, like, we didn't use the word moral yet, moralizing, right? But that's
Yeah.
that's what politics is introduced.
Hmm.
It's kind of what George
Hmm.
Bush famously said, kind of about the war on terror, right? You're either with us or against us. And we
Hmm.
see actually how these moral lines become drawn
Yes.
and they're kind of they're unstated, right? Because we're
Yeah.
unwilling to speak to the politics of our liberal mental health
Hmm.
institutions.
Hmm.
But these
Hmm.
moral lines become deeply institutionalized about what we can say, what
Yeah.
what we can do. Otherwise, we face immediate repercussions, potential security state and stuff like that. I actually wanted to point out, you mentioned something about also being as racialized.
Yes.
Minorities, were assumed guilty. I wanted to actually let one thing off my chest. I was mindful. I don't know if I was going to mention it, but I feel like this is a good place to say it because I'll be honest with you, Lotto. One thing that's really, really struck me in the last year is something that I've kind of um, been observing for many years, but it's just really, really apparent. The amount of labor that racialized minorities, well, let's say anyone really who supports Palestinian liberation, the amount of labor that they put in walking around eggshells, knowing, let's say, if they have a Zionist colleague or anyone else around them, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Thinking twice, thinking 20 times about what words they can say. They want to
Hmm.
speak out about Palestine, right?
Hmm.
What can I say online? What can I speak on social media, right?
Hmm.
What can I do to still do something, but not not to provoke a reaction, right? By like, and that's sort of that's the irony, the sort of racial politics of the acceptability of Zionism is that in
Hmm.
fact, like it's a massive racist event whereby everyone is suddenly walking around
Hmm.
eggshells, right?
Hmm.
But just I feel like we don't surface enough actually how
Hmm.
many people,
Hmm.
and this has been coming up quite often just in the last year, how many people are just putting in so much labor
Mm-hmm.
to speak correctly, right? To condemn, to do the right thing, to be
Mm-hmm.
acceptable according to
Mm-hmm.
these moral and political lines that are
Mm-hmm.
drawn in our mental health settings.
Mm-hmm.
Thing that's really struck me, and this is the thing I really want to surface, is how quickly that can all fall apart at the drop of a dime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it drops in ways that people don't even expect, and that's earth-shattering for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's
Mm-hmm.
not just that they just somehow said the word genocide in a mental health
Mm-hmm.
setting and they're being reprimanded for that, right? That's yes, that's what happened. But actually the baggage behind it is that they
Yes.
spent, so much labor in
Mm-hmm.
being the good Muslim or playing, the good racialized minority or being the,
Yes.
that liberal acceptability.
Yes.
It's been falling so quickly. And I'll just give one example to that actually. There is someone who works very closely with counterterrorism, a racialized Muslim man who works very, very closely with counter extremism policies, prevent counterterrorism. And the Muslim community has been quite critical of him over many
Mm-hmm.
years, right? And he's been really pandering. He's been really, really
Mm-hmm.
pandering. He's been normalizing relations with Israel and Zionists and all that. And after all that labor, he
Mm-hmm.
published one video. I think with Palestine, it had Low Key, the rapper, it had Low Key's lyrics in the background,
Mm-hmm.
and they dropped him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible, right? It's
Mm.
incredible how much we put in. I'm just sorry, I'm kind of just
Yeah.
vocalizing that because I think we don't I think that baggage that people carry
Yes.
is not surface enough vis-a-vis the sort of racist repercussions that we experience.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing that's really,
Yeah.
really suffocating for many. So I just wanted to put
Yeah.
that out there.
Of course, and what I'll say is my siblings divest from it. There is no right way to be. It is a myth. Under a racist regime, there is no acceptability unless you submit completely. And I learned that firsthand. There was nothing I could say or do other than say, I am a Zionist. That would have been enough. And we have to contend with them. These are not good faith efforts. We can pretzel ourselves all we want and say the right things and do the right things. And these systems rely on us to do that because the bad faith of it is they know that we actually are not racists, that we actually are not anti-Semites, that we actually are not patriarchal assholes and everything that comes with it. And because of that, there's a vulnerability that's sort of preyed on that allows us to continue to think that these are good faith. This goes back to the dialogue. I hope many of us are far beyond that, right? There is no configuration or constellation or algorithm that will work, right? No matter how much you make yourselves legible and palatable and say things and all of that, we have seen it doesn't matter how it works, right? Because it's constitutively meant to stabilize forms of power, white supremacy, and anything that might be felt as a threat to that will be eliminated anyway, right? And then I think there's so many, like you're saying, is like, for what, to what end? You just sold out your entire community. You sold out Palestinians who are on the receiving end of this genocide. 365,000 plus people as a low estimate that have been slaughtered in front of us. You're talking about witnessing. Was it worth it? For who? For who to listen to? I think we need to reconstitute who we are speaking to and their willingness, not on an individual level, but a structural level to actually, attend to this. I think this is, if I want to go back to Fanon here, right? This is part of the sociogeny you were talking about. He talks about us being agents of the state. But what does that mean? That means we willfully accept the reach of the state into our work as though that is not a force that we should be contesting, right? And to say that there are ways that this violence is regularized under the guise of assimilation. If only we could teach people to assimilate to the conditions of their oppression, then somehow the violence would lessen. And what he learned over the years and warns us is we need a revolutionary attitude, not an assimilationist attitude, because assimilation not only comes at a high price, but never works. White supremacy does not include you in the matrix unless it's full submission that's involved in that, right? And so I think there are ways in which the invitation is we're at a time where we have to divest from these myths, these seductions, these invitations, and to refuse where you started with the with the Freud Museum is refuse to take on the what is pinned on us when we refuse to compromise. I refuse to compromise because that is a righteous, political, ethical decision of mine, not because I'm recalcitrant, not because I'm, part of the illiberal left, not because I'm, unwilling to negotiate and dialogue. No, because I reject the premise that this is coming from, because the premise is one based in racism, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. And nothing that comes from that premise can be good. Nothing. Right? And that needs to, I think this, if in the last year we've learned anything, it's our starting points cannot be the starting point of those who would see us murdered and see our siblings murdered and think that that is justifiable. It cannot be the starting point.
Yeah.
We go from.
I really appreciate that point. And, thank you so much for raising that because I think in a way we need to start thinking about resistance and what resistance means for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a point here which come like I think that's sort of we're already raising one point, right? Like certainly we can't by playing the game, right? We're not we're eventually going to lose, right? So if you play according to the pins that are given to you, as you're saying, like you're pandering to liberal acceptability, choosing, trying to figure out exactly how to be, the good Muslim or the good Arab, whatever it might
Yeah.
be, that it just simply is paper thin. I
Can
let's
I
let's
say
open.
something quickly, Tarek? Just
Yes,
in there?
please.
Because by playing the good Arab, you're creating a bad Arab. Just to put
100%.
it clearly as well.
I've used that actually example because I've spoken about that also in my own life where I've spoken about sort of I think also as racialized Arabs or racialized Muslim psychologists there's a certain acceptability, there's a liberal acceptability that might be given to me, right? And
Yes.
I was once crossing the border from Canada to United States and I played that card. I felt incredibly bad. I'm just admitting here that, I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
was years ago, but it, crossing the border and being like, oh, I'm a psychologist, I'm this, I'm that, I've done, like you could play that
Right.
card. But it dawned on me that the moment you play that card, you're throwing the next person under the bus who may not have
Absolutely.
been blessed with the privileges that you have to get to the
Mm-hmm.
point to be able to do that, right? So in fact, you're throwing a lot of people under the bus
Mm-hmm.
who can't
Mm-hmm.
play that card. And I think that's a part of the sort of politics of respectability that we don't, the shadow of the politics of respectability that we never really focus on is actually how many people you're throwing under the bus by playing cards of acceptability and respectability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about resistance then, because I think that's coming up quite often in spaces that we're holding, you know. So we've spoken now. We haven't unpacked too much. I'm just gonna kind of mention that we we're recognizing that the liberal acceptability of Zionism in our mental health professions, in our settings, mental health settings, have wide-reaching sort of racist impacts, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
we're just like affirming that. It has
Hmm.
impact on professions, the history of our profession, right? If we think about
Hmm.
um, how even until today, we tend to talk about sort of the evil of bad psychology being in the past, but really it
Yeah.
continues. It's ever present. We know there's a
Hmm.
research study published by Nader Hakim and his colleagues about sort of the erasure of the settler-colonial occupation in the whole field of social experimental psychology, right? The whole field of
Hmm.
social experimental psychology. I mean, they just did like a systemic analysis and they showed that every time they talk about Israel and Palestine, they barely mention occupation. They barely mention ethnic cleansing. They barely mention
Yes.
all these things, right? Like this is deeply embedded within our fields. It has impacts
Hmm.
on clinicians. We're talking about clinicians feeling unable to speak.
Yeah.
Mental health professionals telling me that they don't even know if they can bring up Palestine with their patients, right?
Hmm.
The fear of disciplinary measures,
Hmm.
fear of counterterrorism allegations, right? It has impact obviously on people coming in, feeling
Yes.
unable, feeling like it's not a safe space, right? Not knowing if they can
Hmm.
actually really bring up Palestine, um, and in fact being reprimanded. And I've heard some really terrible cases of people being
Yeah.
reprimanded ways. So like we're just holding on to all of that, right? Like
Yes.
there's all of
Yes.
that, right? Like we're just
Yes.
taking all of that, and I know that's really heavy, but we're just going to put it on the table,
Right.
and we're talking about resistance, right? And I think
Mhm.
I want to put that out to you because there's also there's I think there's maybe certain liberal recipes we fall into
Hmm.
when it comes to resistance,
Mm.
right? I'm not now making any moral judgment about good and bad, but you know, a lot of writing of letters to our mental health, um, you know, bodies, the body,
Yes.
American Psychological Association, British Psychological Society, all of these
Hmm.
things. People are trying to publish articles,
Hmm.
otherwise engaging with mainstream institutions. I think that's kind of been more or less where we are in terms of like what we're doing. And now maybe sort of the final discussion topic before we maybe open it up. I liked how you're kind of already beginning with a point of resistance. Like you got to
Yes.
recognize the politics. You got to
Yes.
understand how we're being racialized. Think about the significance of Palestine, who you're throwing under the bus when you play respectability.
Yes.
Resist that. Don't fall into that. But do you have any other thoughts and ideas about like, yeah, I mean,
Yeah. I
where
mean,
should we be going?
yes. I mean, part of it, I want to sort of say that there are different modes of resistance, and I certainly don't want to conflate the resistance we're seeing on the ground, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza, with us sort of, right, um, being a thorn in people's sides, and also to recognize that the continuum is there on purpose and that it's all needed because the idea of resisting, in my mind, is to always contest what is normalized and what can be troubled, right? So what you're saying is the acceptability of Zionism as just like a foregone conclusion in our field is something I feel like we have an ethical imperative to contest, especially if we're saying Zionism is racism, which I believe. Zionism is a form of racist supremacy, right? Then the resistance becomes, so I think part of it is also locating what is it that we are in an antagonistic relationship with. And I think that gets us out of this idea of like, I think folks are afraid of being called anti-Semitic. And I understand the material implications of that. And also, if our focus is on Zionism as a structure, a political structure and ideology, then that needs to be our focus of how we discuss this and not get detracted from this false allegation that you will always be on the back foot defending. I reject the premise of that from the get-go. And we can focus on the ways in which we disrupt. Like anything else, we must be able to disrupt the ability of our systems to name for us the contours of what is acceptable and what's not. Just like you were saying, for us to push up against these, counterterrorism trainings and to contest what the purview of the field is. I would do the same thing in terms of the acceptability of the racism of Zionism as just an acceptable, oh, this is a position one can take. It's like, yeah, you can take that position. Certainly, I can't. I'm sorry. I wish I had the magic ability to tell people not to take that position. Despite people's belief about how much of a powerful monster I am, I actually don't have that ability to do that. What I do have is the ability to say, in every space I see that, I will be a counterforce to that. In every place I see that, I will be the one to say, this is an unacceptable position. And to understand why I'm saying that's an unacceptable position, precisely because if we go back to Samah, it is a social order that relies on the subjugation of somebody else. And that is an ethical position, an issue of justice in our field that there's an imperative for us actually to come up against, right? And so if we can continue to be sort of clear, clarity has been something I have been thinking about so much over the context of this last year, especially. Of course, I'd started thinking about it before when this sort of Zionist campaign happened against me, to remain clear on our positions, on their political implications, on the logic of why I'm taking this position, and to remain uncompromising in that. We all know now what it means and how quickly things can melt down when you refuse to bend. And that's what I want us to sort of remember. We can feel so small in the face of it all. And then I want us all to think about the fact that, let me give a recent example. There's a child psychiatry conference that was happening in the United States. And there was a panel that people were presenting on that was showing a documentary called I think, Life in Gaza. It was about, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the title of this, but it was about the life of children in Gaza. Okay. This conference, it was accepted. It was a panel. People were going to do it. There was an Arab caucus that was putting this on. And then the organizers got one letter from the Israeli Child Psychiatry Organization saying, we have heard from Israeli members, and I want you all to remember the UK Israel Lawyers for Israel. We have gotten complaints from members that they are scared to come to this conference because this documentary will be shown. Okay. Not a mandatory documentary, one of many panels that is happening. That one letter had the organizers insist that the documentary director snip out the parts of this documentary that mention the word genocide.
That's ridiculous.
These are examples we have already, right? So that is happening. And I think, for us to think that somehow if we're not engaged or if we're not resisting, if we're not pushing up against that, those things aren't going to happen. No, we understand the reason why things that seem so absurd. I mean, we can talk about that. We can be like, this sounds like it's not real life, right? An Israeli psychiatrist traveling to the United States at a conference feels afraid on the same day that people were burned alive in tents in Gaza, right? It can sound that absurd because it is, right? But if we can understand that the mere mention of Palestine creates that type of disruption, I would say to you that that is precisely what we need to deregularize the ability of places like this to do this sort of gymnastics to allow this to happen. But to remember also that our mere presence disorganizes because it's a reminder that the world is not as a settler envisions it. The world is not free of Palestine. The world is not free of Palestinians. Palestinians are alive. They will not be erased. And that is a shorthand for us. If we can see the counterforce, it gives us a clue about the ways to resist. Insist on Palestine.
Mhm.
Insist on your presence there. Insist on the fact that we actually need to speak to these things as a central component of our ethical duties, not only to our work, but to the world.
Yeah.
There's a lot more we can say, but I'm looking at time.
No, no, I really appreciate that. Honestly, I think there's something about that insistence, right? Like we're also insisting on bearing witness in a way as
Yes.
well. And, I think that rehearsal, the practice of bearing witness is one that we have to always continuously maintain. And not only about Palestine, I think in a way, one thing I've been talking about a lot lately, I'm not so sure exactly if it's the best way, but I think we have to also kind of speak about Zionism as
Mhm.
a political project, the racialization, as the racialization it exudes into the world, right? If we think about the fact that, and many people don't notice, but in 1975, the UN resolution, I forgot the number, it was passed that Zionism is racism,
Mhm.
right? And it was understood from that point onwards until it was removed due to Israeli insistence before the Oslo Accords. It was Israel that requested that UN resolution be removed for the sake of the Oslo process.
Mhm.
But we can imagine between 1975 and the early 90s, it was understood that
Mhm.
the experience, the observation of racism that we're seeing has has a history, has a trajectory that we can draw upon, right? And that's why we can never teach racism without politics, right? Because
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
the teaching of racism without politics is just simply a liberal, checkboxing
Yeah.
exercise. We
Yes.
well, we can understand that a settler-colonial project is inherently racist,
Mhm.
right? And that Zionism is, of course, a settler-colonial project. And therefore, when the whole world agreed that Zionism is racism, in a way
Mhm.
that then really makes that absurdity, that kind of perversion we're talking about, like, how is this happening, right? Like, what's going on?
Mhm.
But we've moved away from pointing out the political underpinnings of all the racism that we're seeing. And we
Mhm.
have to we have to get back to, I think, also naming and understanding where racism as a whole comes from. And it's not only about that, right? We think about racism more broadly. We're seeing increasing nationalist politics in the global north,
Yes.
white supremacy is coming out in many different ways. And I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways in which we also have to make those connections very clear that this is not isolated if we think about it, right? If
Right.
we think about all the different forms of imperialism, the United States, all across the world, and all its military
Mhm.
bases, we can make those connections and it has been made. And that's having a very sort of grassroots anti-racist perspective, one
Mhm.
that is vehemently against any form of occupation, any form of, you know, um, yeah, sort of extractive supremacy that we're seeing
Great.
all around. So on that note, are you are you okay for us to
Yes, please.
like open the
Yes.
conversation? Maybe
Yes.
I'm thinking actually about our really, really wonderful BSL interpreters. I am recognition of the labor that goes into doing the work that they do. So I'd like us to maybe just take just a few minutes just to let them take a pause for themselves. In the meantime, Michelle is going to be collecting some thoughts and questions. And yeah, if anyone wants to get up and come back, let's just say around, yeah, in 5 minutes. So we'll just give it 9:15. I hope that's okay for our interpreters as well. And then we'll keep going from here. And I'll be still here. So yeah. And I think while the BSL interpreters have a break, we can still talk, obviously, in case anyone is just sitting around. We just won't engage in any of the questions or anything.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, yeah, take your time. Take your time. Take your time. Michelle, all good?
Yep, all good. I hope our wonderful BSL interpreters have had a chance to catch their breath and get
Yeah,
through.
yeah. We can still give them another minute, but I just wanted to also give a heartfelt thanks to you for joining us today, and I just really also wanted to visualize for everyone that Michelle has been like a really great support to me and to so many people, I think, here in London, and just like with the work that she does and her thinking and ideas. So I'm so grateful that you took the time to like moderate for us today.
No, thank you, Tarek. It was an honor, and yeah, I'm actually really excited to be able to speak to Lara directly, asking some of my questions mixed in with. I think we're getting quite a few questions from the audience, so people are really, really quite inspired and have found an outlet to ask lots and lots of things that I think have been preying on people's minds for a long time. So hopefully it will be a rich Q&A.
I'm just gonna go ahead and let me just speak really quickly to the BSL and just making sure that they're okay to go.
The thumbs up and smiles galore.
Oh,
I
yeah.
appreciate it.
Fantastic. Awesome. Great. Let's go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you firstly to both of you for such a rich discussion. I think it's given me a lot to think about. Articulated, I think, a lot of things that many people probably in the audience have been thinking about and not really knowing how to make sense of some of the experiences that we've been having, some of the things that we've been witnessing in terms of our lives, our professional lives, our personal lives as well. And I think before I go to some of the questions, I just want to firstly that there have been lots of questions about what book Lara's published. So I actually have a copy here, so I'll just hold it up. So it's Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. So it's open, if you're UK based, you can get it from lots of libraries, order it online. It's an excellent book. And yeah, my copy is covered in lots of random, sticky notes and things that I'll be relying on. So I definitely recommend reading it. And it will kind of, some of the things that have been spoken about today, I think will help kind of, you can take time to think about those concepts further. And as I mentioned, there are quite a few questions, so I'm just going to invoke moderator privilege and ask Lara a couple of questions of my own, if that's okay, based on some of the discussion that we've been having and some of the things that you've said. So there are kind of two themes that I've picked up on that I think have formed conversations that I've had with colleagues in sort of spaces where people have really been trying to, particularly spaces within the psy-disciplines that people have been really trying to understand. And thinking about how the psy-disciplines themselves actually contribute to the occupation, to settler colonialism. And I guess my first question is in reference to where your and Tarek's conversation ended about, the Israeli clinician who claimed to feel very upset and very scared at the prospect of witnessing this documentary. And we have heard of many such instances of sort of fear being cited, and fearing for safety, etc., being cited. And I guess the more clinical way of putting that would be, I'm traumatized and I'm feeling traumatized, or I've had traumatic experiences. And we've seen in psychiatry and in psychology that sort of play into that narrative as well, with in the academic sphere in terms of publication of papers about how Israelis feel traumatized by rocket sirens and what that might mean, and that kind of completely being taken out of context of the occupation, not being mentioned at all. And then I think a more recent example of that entering into popular media has been this story in CNN, this attempt to sort of humanize IOF soldiers and, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks, etc., and how, they're sort of experiencing PTSD and the war crimes that they've committed, such as bulldozing hundreds of Palestinians, being a sort of a footnote in that story, not being the story itself, the story being the fact that this person is traumatized by what they've done. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how our understanding of trauma within the discipline, our understanding of trauma-informed care that's completely depoliticized, how it means that we end up actively sort of contributing to settler colonialism, to the acceptability of liberal Zionism, and how trauma-informed care ends up meaning adapting to harm for the people who are colonized and normalizing the harm that's inflicted for the people who are doing the colonizing. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit on how we sort of resist that narrative, I guess, and its weaponization.
Yes, that's thank you so much for going there. And I appreciate the shout out for the book too. And well, thank you on behalf of myself and Stephen. Um, I I suppose I'll start there. That you're talking about the article that just came out, right? And I think there's a way in which we are pulled to think that this is a misuse or an abuse of psychological theory to have, or a pop psychology sort of, we're paying attention to the trauma that this genocidaire IOF soldier has actually admitted, right? I think this is the piece that you're referring to, this most recent one. And we're invited to to sort of attune to the trauma of being a traumatizer more than the actual impact or the actual slaughter that's been done, despite the fact that this person is very clear and very specific about the genocidal acts and war crimes that they've been engaged in. There's a way in which we're invited to think that is a misuse, again, of psychological theory. What I would invite us to do in response to you is to say, how can we think about psychological theory and method as always having been in service of power and in stabilizing and priming us actually to be more attentive to those in power than to those who are vulnerable? And that's, I think, even the construction of the concept of trauma as we know it today, or certainly the category of post-traumatic stress disorder. Nadia Abul-Hajj has a wonderful book about combat trauma and how it was actually the war against Vietnamese people, the imperial war that the United States waged against Vietnamese folks, and the soldier who came back, quote unquote, traumatized, that it was a state project along with the psychology discipline that rehabilitated the soldier so that it becomes the soldier that we empathize with and not the person who is deeply not only harmed, but violated by an imperial machine that sent that soldier to begin with, right? And so I want us to sort of, anytime we're invoking trauma-informed care or trauma theory, is to understand that there's an entire industry behind this and research that is often supported by the Department of Defense, by all these sorts of. I am not saying that people are not traumatized in different conditions or that there isn't value to the work we do that localizes the actual impact of systems of oppression. What I am saying is that we are in a world, kind of like what you were attuning to, in which we are supposed to attend to the trauma without the traumatizer, without naming what it is that actually did the traumatizing. That is a much easier focus for the psy-disciplines to say, oh, here is this, I think it's called, like, now in the context of Gaza, is like an unaccompanied child, right? Or a child that's unaccompanied. This is an actual category that is now, is being used. And I think there's something about that. That is the dislocation and the depoliticization. It's happening in front of our eyes, where the reason the child doesn't have anybody to accompany them is because a genocidal machine has eliminated this person's parents as part of an annihilatory campaign against Palestinians. And so let me make this more concrete. I would divest from the use of any of our trauma theories if we are not also prepared to speak very plainly and clearly about who it is that does the traumatizing, why the traumatization was happening, and how it happened, right? And this goes back, I think, to some of the conversations we're having. Is part of the way Stephen and I were very intent on writing this book was to be, I would say, unflinchingly honest in naming settler colonialism as a structure that relies on an asphyxiatory regime against which Palestinians have always resisted. Are there traumas that get caused within that? Absolutely. But there are larger traumas that also get enforced on people or imposed on people when we refuse to name their reality, the reality that they are not confused about, by the way, right? An example from the book, just to make this a little bit more textured, is a program that was done by Save the Children in Palestine, where there was a grant that was given. We know how NGOs work. You get a grant for a couple of years. You're supposed to do what it says. They were piloting a manualized treatment for trauma to work with children whose homes had been demolished, right? And in the course of a year, one of the clinicians we spoke to who was in charge of this did a sort of study around this and found that children were becoming more symptomatic and more traumatized precisely because they went through a decommunalized process of processing why the demolition was happened. And instead, we're going to the manualized trauma treatment that would have it be an individual encounter in which the therapist was tasked with processing the feelings of that child, but without the political context. And what was found was there's actually a communal process that's already available to attend to this and to say the house demolition is happening because this is a settler-colonial regime that is intent on erasing Palestinians. And in order to erase Palestinians in places like Silwan or Sheikh Jarrah or Al-Quds or anywhere else in Palestine is to demolish their homes. When you take out the context of naming who does the traumatizing, why, and who's supporting that, there is actually more traumatic symptoms that are involved, right? So I just kind of wanted to give that texture because there's examples we have of when you strip people of the ability to call themselves Palestinians or to call them, and when they go through refugee processes and they're not allowed to say their identity, then we can see the construction of trauma in a particular way. So I think there's ways in which we already have models for how to resist against this. And also, what are the things we need to actually be careful about when we use these or mobilize these theories without being critical of where they come from or who it serves and who it doesn't serve.
Thank you, Lara. I think that was a really, really thank you for the examples as well, I think, because I think a lot of people find it, while they find the narratives that are being used really uncomfortable and they know that there's something wrong, it becomes quite hard to sort of exactly articulate and pinpoint exactly where that is going, and actually naming the fact that it's by design rather than just a sort of an aberrant aspect that, you know, we're not practicing psychiatry, psychology properly, that's why it's happening, when actually this is a product of our disciplines. I think linked to that, there are a couple of questions that maybe I'm going to combine that are sort of related to this idea of resistance from within the profession, specifically with regards to kind of providing care and also in terms of academically. So someone has asked, what steps need to be taken to decolonize the psychological discipline? Is this even possible? And I think, you know, talking a bit to the fact that, you know, is this sort of just the sort of the discipline in of itself? Is it inherently like this? And people sort of asking, you know, any advice to psychology students as to what they can do and what future steps they can take to make changes within the field of psychology and ensure their work rejects the normalized politics that you've been talking about. So I think this talk has provoked a bit of an existentialist crisis in some of the clinicians attending. So we're getting quite a few questions about people thinking, where do I go from here?
Yes. Well, I imagine I'm going to sort of say that I imagine this was viscerally felt. And like you were saying, that sometimes we need spaces that speak it outright, because otherwise the effect is that we sit in our training spaces or in our professional spaces and we are left to hold all of this. And like I said, we feel it deeply, and then we end up localizing it within ourselves and think somehow, if I just did this differently, if I moved differently through the world or whatever the case was, this would be easier. So it's not meant to, perhaps it is meant to have an existential crisis, only in as much as that existential crisis allows us to always lead with being antagonistic to norms of the field. The field's going to be fine, right? The people that are vulnerable as a result of the violence of the field are not. And I think if we're within it, I'm somebody who's trained within the field. And because of that, I feel it's my ethical duty actually to be the loudest critic, because we know the history. This is the other thing that I would say to folks is know our history. Kind of like what Tarek was saying, is like, we don't actually have to reach far to understand what the violence of the field actually is. And it relies on us forgetting. It relies on us believing in a post-racial world, in a post-colonial world, and all these sorts of things, because that is the way that it ends up stabilizing and things can seamlessly hide. And then anyone who says, hey, this is still a problem, becomes a problem child and a dissident that can then be expelled, right? This is the history all the way. I mean, hello, Freud. This is the history of our field, is one that follows this pattern. And so remember the history, resist against this idea that this is somehow a crisis that is just a crisis of this time. To the contrary, it allows us to read a particular logic that repeats itself over and over and over again. And when we know the logic, we also have a blueprint or a map as to all the seams upon which we can continue to push, right? And there are so many, this is the other thing that I would offer to students, because I understand and I appreciate the vulnerability and the sort of sensitivities to being in spaces in which you actually might rely on the people who are causing harm to pass you, to be recommenders. So I don't want to speak out of turn or feel like I'm just like I don't know what price there is to this. I'm speaking from a place of actually understanding very well the price that's involved in this. And also to say that you will be made to feel that there are no other people that think like you. You will be made to feel that you are the extremist in the room that is asking for too much. You will also be promised that you should just go through this as is and keep your head down. And after you graduate, you can do whatever you want, right? All of these are stabilizing forces for a discipline as is, rather than what it could become now, rather than in the future. There's always a promise of in the future this will be, but that's how systems of oppression stabilize themselves. They sort of demobilize any activation against it and against the sort of norm and going. And so what I would say is that there are many of us. This is on one hand a really exciting time to be in the quote unquote psy-disciplines. This is an example of it. There are incredible people doing work on the ground. I see my siblings in the struggle on here, whether it's Feluke or Robert or Gail Lewis or any of these folks who are in the UK who are doing the work. There are so many people across the world. There are networks of care. There are so many of us that you might see, and we do a lot of work of really, talking to students, being mentors around these sorts of things, saying there are other ways of being and functioning within this system. And to not have those who are the face of normativity be the only story that is told about what happens. And anywhere there's an oppressive system, there's also a story of resistance against it. And those are the things that are disappeared. So when I say remember our history, it's remember the history of oppression, and then remember that every step along the way, there have also been people who have been dogged about documenting the atrocities that our field has done, about resisting against it, and being disciplined for doing so, perhaps. Which brings in the final thing that I'll say is that community really is, it's not just, as we say in Arabic, it's not just a thing we say, that we do better in community. We do because there's a distribution of responsibility, of affect, of labor around these things. And even in the moments we feel fear, we also feel that there are locked arms with us. And that is what allows us to push through that fear and not deflect from like, yes, this is a feeling of fear. And also there's a larger cause that we're working towards here. And there's a duty that's involved in that. It's harder to remember that when we have people who are in alignment with us, so find your folks, find your people, and don't let people tell you that we're not out here.
Thank you, Lara. I also wanted to, Tarek, if you will, if you could also comment a bit as well, especially given that you've been practicing in the UK context as well, and many people joining us from the UK.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, there's very little to add to what Lara's saying. Maybe I'll just keep it really, really brief. I just wanted to maybe share just two short thoughts, and both of those were inspired directly by Lara. I think there's something of this forced atomization. We spoke about this, Lara, right? There's this experience that I think is actually enacted, I would say, maybe by design, where we are meant to feel quite isolated. And that for everyone listening, I just wanted to take that moment and just say, I think we recognize that experience of suffocation, that experience of isolation, and we just wanted to hold on to that because it is actually a very, very difficult experience. And when we talk about censorship, as I often mention, to when we think about the implications of that, especially within the war on terror, censorship is not simply the erasure of words, right? The absence of words, the inability to speak is one that's profoundly harmful to us. And it's an experience of violence. We don't mention that. But that managed isolation, the inability to communicate, that inability to find that sense of community with others for something that's deeply touching to you is actually a form of violence. Um, and to that, I'll just mention one last thing. I mean, I think there's something about sort of a liberal capitalist logics whereby we're always trying to seek community through our professions, right? Like, oh, I'm an engineer, so my community is just a bunch of engineers, or I'm a psychologist, so my community is psychologists, right? Like we know, like I think there's the element of like where we have to push back against a number of logics, actually, right? Like that true solidarity and community building won't come from our professions, right? Like they are designed in a very particular way, but that's not your true community. And I think when we think about how we learn from each other and we have to break down barriers of professions and being able to develop, and I think that's something for us at Healing Justice London that we're trying to take seriously, is to think through processes of healing or spaces of getting together. Let's say right now, one of the things that someone might come to me is like, oh, I need a space for mental health professionals. Well, actually, many of us are experiencing something very similar across the board. And so thinking through what does community building really mean for you? What is it that we really want out of a community? I think these are just bigger questions for us to think about as well.
Thank you, Tarek. And I think both of those also kind of speak to, because a lot of people have been asking questions about resistance in the context of absence of safety, knowing that actually, true safety doesn't exist in the way that we want it to, and that many people have been subject to disciplinary procedures, to sort of, the police being notified, both in terms of professional contexts, but outside of that, knowing that various forms of resistance are prescribed under British law and other sort of the laws of other governments as well. So there's a lot of I guess lots of questions that I think maybe you've already spoken to in the course of what you're saying in terms of talking about community and talking about sort of kind of being principled. But people asking, how do we resist this weaponized notion of safety in daily life? How do we continue to resist knowing that actually you run the risk of arrest, you run the risk of basically triggering the entire sort of carceral punitive mechanisms of both your profession and of the state. People wondering about that. And I actually just kind of wanted to say that this is something that I've been thinking about, and I've actually spoken to Tarek about before as well. And I have to say that for people who are listening, I was really I've reflected a lot on passages from Lara's book that have come directly from Palestinian clinicians in occupied Palestine, and thinking about so I mean it's an understatement, but the absence of safety that the active violence that they experience, we can't even begin to imagine what it's like. I mean, we worry about things like the prevent duty, for example, or being arrested, and that doesn't even begin to compare with the kind of violence in which Palestinian therapists, psychiatrists, etc., are practicing resistance in various forms and shapes. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to some of that, Lara, for the people listening who are kind of really thinking about how they resist, and maybe like providing some of that context from things that you've written about in your book and the research you've done and the many conversations and examples of resistance that you've witnessed.
Thank you. Thank you for that and for collating this. And I just kind of want to say to folks that I don't want to undersell the reality, the material reality of these fears, right? They're not, sometimes maybe they're planted within us or lodged within us as part of a disciplinary campaign. The way that racism and sort of counterterrorism and all these things work is that it can be quite arbitrary on purpose to have the effect of discipline. We discipline ourselves and we discipline other people because the state can't possibly keep up with every single individual thing. So if all of us are worried we're going to be the next target, there's an internalization of the state, even when the state doesn't reach into you. So part of it for me is reading that logic. Like if we're feeling fear, is also locating it within a larger, like Tarek was saying, this like war on terror has actually changed the entire world and the way that surveillance and policing happens. So there's a reality to that. The piece that I will say is that never in the history of the world, in contexts of oppression, and certainly not in Palestine, does the lack of safety mean that life-making efforts are not made, or that attempts to create different modes of being and portals of life, right? Kind of to your point is that I think sometimes we interpret the lack of safety as the end point. And I think that when we feel lack of safety, it's because we are reality testing about the failures of the world under these oppressive conditions, the effect of which is the lack of safety for people who don't fall in line, whether that's for Black folks or for Indigenous folks or for Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims or trans folks or queer folks, whoever is non-normative in respect to the hegemonic norm will always live in a space of non-safety, because safety is guaranteed when you fall in line. But part of what we were saying is that it's not even guaranteed under that, right? So it's also recognizing that even our ideas around safety might be myths around that, and to always trouble the sense of that. So that's number one, I would say, is to remember that a lack of safety doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities to create life and other ways, other modes of being, to trouble this idea of safety to begin with. And the last thing I'll say is it might come at a price. I don't want to downplay that. There are so many examples we've had of that, right? And I think there's a way in which the world we want to live in will include potential sacrifices or wagers that we make. Each of us have to do that based on the context in which we live. Oftentimes that has to do with a calculation of what types of risks we're able to make. I think this is why if we look at organizing that's happening in direct action, we can see who's more likely to be able to put themselves on the line versus other people. There are always strategic calculations that come with that. But at the end of the day, when we're living under fascistic terms, which we are seeing happening everywhere, right? That I think the illusion of safety is very much an illusion. And so if within that, there's an action that can be made that understands always that when we align with righteous causes, it will always come at a price because you're disrupting something, right? And I want to say that plainly. I don't think there are ways to engage in this and remain entirely untouched. The hope is that being touched by this also transforms you in ways you couldn't even imagine. It connects you to a long history of people who have done this before us, of every privilege and modicum of quote unquote safety we're saying has been forged because people made those sacrifices before us. We're in a long lineage. That's what we mean by the struggle, that this is forged through struggle over time. And I think if we can also think about the ways in which those linkages are made, then perhaps it allows us also to reconceptualize what it means to make those sorts of sacrifices or put ourselves in harm's way, whether it's by the state or losing a job or anything. Again, I'm not trying to be frivolous around this. I'm saying this is a calculation everybody has to make. And also, I don't know how else liberation is won, you know?
Thank you, Lara. And I think I'm really sort of struck by what you said when you talk about, it's meant to, knowledge is meant to transform you. Without that, it's just sort of information. It's meant to make you want to transform the world around you as well. And that means change. Otherwise, it's not true knowledge. And it's interesting because that kind of links into a couple of questions that people have been asking that I want to combine about the whole sort of notion of decolonizing and how disruptive decolonizing has to be. So someone has said, a number of colleagues support the idea of decolonizing psychotherapy and believe that it can be done through reasonable dialogue and discussion without the sort of confrontations that could divide institutions and threaten their existence. I believe those confrontations are inevitable and can only be avoided by unacceptable compromises. And I guess I was wondering whether you could speak to that, and also kind of talk a bit about, because there are some other questions talking about fears around co-option of resistance, co-option of language. I, for example, recently attended a talk by Dr. Samah Jaber where she was talking about the very Palestinian concept of samud, and people understood that as resilience. Resilience in the way that, a therapist would understand resilience as in just kind of normalizing people to living under neoliberal forms of suffering, and that is how that translation ended up happening and how that language got distorted. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the reasonable dialogue and reasonable discussion and everyone just being very sort of reasonable and very kind of polite towards each other, and whether that is conducive to change.
Or decolonization.
Especially in the UK,
Certainly.
we love being polite. Absolutely.
Yes.
Love being polite.
Yes.
So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Well, the original colonizers, of course, we love polite. We love polite subjects, right? Colonized subjects. Let me just say, beyond tongue in cheek, is that there's a way in which anything that has the power to transform will be co-opted. We know when something has the power to transform by the quickness with which it becomes defanged and sort of subsumed into liberal ways of functioning. So decolonization becomes another word for we shouldn't treat people badly. And it becomes completely disconnected from its actual, if we can think about anti-colonial struggles and what that actually means. And if we're talking about decolonization, which is why, a lot of folks have stopped using the word because it's been co-opted by academia or been written about at great lengths, and then an entire year of a genocide and more has happened. And those very people that write about decolonization are nowhere to be seen, right? It's because these concepts are not meant to just be cognitive concepts. They're meant to be in action and in a relational and political dynamic that is always emerging and evolving based on what is happening on the ground as well. So when I talk about decolonization, I make it very clear to folks that I'm not talking about this as an abstract concept. I'm talking about land back. Decolonize is to give land back. Things that were stolen must be returned. People must be allowed to return back to Palestine, right? The ways that happens, I think then when you say that to somebody, they're like, well, how is that going to happen? We're always tasked with deciding all of that up front. That is a process that can be determined, and certainly determined by indigenous people whose decision-making process might actually not fit the pace or the structure that we imagine it does either, right? But so if we're going to say, can the psy-disciplines be decolonized? I think sometimes we can think about that as an oxymoron, particularly if the insistence is on a particular type of legibility and reason that stabilizes coloniality, right? Then the answer is no, absolutely not. If it's about stabilization and there's no transformation that happens, there's no structural change, there's no dismantling of anything that allowed the condition for our disciplines to become as they are, then we should just be using the word of transformation, maybe, or changing or reform, right? and for me, and I think about decolonization, not only is it about land back and very intimately tied with land and resources and reclamation of things that were stolen, there also is a way in which it's disrupting any modes of domination, extraction, and exploitation. So if that is allowed to persist as a logic that is constitutive to the process, I just need to ask any student here, any trainee, about how their labor is used, then we have our answer for us. There's nothing decolonizing that's happening about anything. The last thing I'll say about that is that, like abolition, when I think about it, it is not just about dismantling actual structures or bricks and mortar places that create the possibility for incarceration. It's also about a relational process that disrupts the channels by which domination, exploitation, and extraction happen. And so if a place is having a series called Decolonizing this and that, and yet the relational process is one that is racist, sexist, exploitative, I think it's okay for us to just be like, just because you use the word doesn't mean it's actually being enacted. And I say that not as a way to shame, but to say it's a commitment. It's a daily commitment that we wake up to, just like Sumud. It's a daily commitment to say that I will move through this world in a way, in antagonism to oppressive structures, rather than shore them up or stabilize them.
Thank you, Lara. I think we've managed to you've done such an excellent job of answering so many different questions at the same time, which has done a great job for condensing for me. And I think that also speaks a bit too, because a few people wanted to understand exactly what you meant by the term samud. And again, I would encourage them to also read your book because you expand on it more in there, and kind of asking about what that looks like in the context of practice. There is one question that has cropped up that I think is quite interesting. A couple of people have asked that has been arisen from your discussion around this sort of good Arab, bad Arab binary and how to sort of whether it's possible to escape it. So someone has said, thanks for sharing the thoughts about the temptation to position oneself as the respectable pro-Palestinian, in my case, which then creates the non-respectable alternative as a default, to create discomfort which requires a degree of courage. How can you help to cultivate this? And then related to that, someone has sort of, I guess, asked, perhaps a bit more pessimistically said, by playing the role of the good Arab, you inevitably reinforce the existence of the bad Arab. However, by refusing to play this role, you do not automatically stop the reproduction of the bad Arab. How can one find a mode of critique that transcends this imaginary confrontation? And then sort of referencing this kind of idea of like the war and terror constantly creating a bad Arab from anyone who sort of resists imperialism, etc. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, whether it's possible to escape this binary in any way.
Sure. I think if we're going to escape this binary is to divest from the premise on which it's created, right? Which means, the language we think about it, or as Tarek started us off, like positioning ourselves like, I'm not this, or we see in the context of the United States, for example, American flag hijabs, as though that's going to be the thing that, positions you or makes you more legible or safe or not the target of any of any violence. So it's a divestment from the conditions that create the binary to begin with, and saying, that premise itself is flawed, and that premise is what causes a binary to break down, where there's an impossible choice here, because that impossible choice already buys in to the premise that's set for us. That's what dialogue is. Like, you don't get to just engage in dialogue neutrally. There are things you have to agree upon before, right? And what I will say is that I don't think that's an imaginary confrontation. This is a confrontation that we deal with every single day. And to rally the courage to the sibling that said that is to ground ourselves in the history of revolutionary fighters that have shown us what it means to have courage, to resist the contouring of one's being and the insistence that you must give up certain things for you to get your rights. If we can return to that condition over and over and over again, it's like, I think there's a way in which, like, you don't have to argue for the things that are yours, like land, right? Like dignity, like sumud, a belief in the right of return. I think the moment we venture into proving that those things are necessary, we've already accepted the premise that sets up this binary, right? So I think that's the place where I would go, and that courage is one that does not need to be invented. It is a reclamation of all the people, some of whom are incarcerated, some of whom bodies are still being held because that is what they, by Zionist entity, because that is what they stand for. And some of whom are our contemporaries who are showing us what it means to reject the premises that are set by somebody else who insists on something from you. And that something is not neutral. It's in a reality, a settler-colonial reality bending, which we talk about in our book as well.
Thank you, Lara. I think we have time for one final sort of question, if that's okay. And I'm just kind of, I guess I want to finish, perhaps maybe again invoke my privilege to ask one of mine as a sort of a final message, because I know lots of people attending are clinicians and are practicing and kind of want to think about how to sort of apply things. One thing I've noticed that's happening at this sort of phase of the genocide is that, and I've seen this happen in various professional settings as well, is that there's this huge urgency to help. People really want to help. They don't necessarily want to resist, but they want to help. And that sort of help looks like traditionally how help has always looked like, in terms of intervening in the global south through kind of aid projects, NGOs, therapy initiatives. Lots of people want to find out about. I attended a conference recently, and people wanted to find out about various kind of therapy programs that were going to be delivered in Gaza and things like that. And I was just wondering if you had any particular message for, you know, therapists, psychiatrists, etc., who are desperate to get involved in this kind of work, going into it under the assumption that, you know, there's a way of working neutrally, that there's a way of just divorcing yourself from everything around you and just kind of going in on humanitarian grounds, ignoring the wall, but just thinking about how to get aid across the wall, if that sort of makes sense. What your sort of message would be to them in light of everything you've said and all the discussion that's sort of been had. Is that even possible?
No. My message is no. And let me follow up with that, is to say that if that continues to be a possibility in your mind, somewhere within you, I want to invite you to think about the ways in which imperial violence and settler-colonial violence has lodged itself inside you in ways that might be seamless. And that's the point of intervention, right? Folks in the global south do not need charity. They need solidarity. And if the way you express your solidarity is through these very practice channels that we've been told over and over and over and over again, cause harm because you're doing nothing to disrupt the cycle of violence that creates the conditions of suffering that you're trying to ameliorate to begin with. The invitation is to reflect internally and say, where does this still live inside of me and why? And from there are many possibilities that open up because they're in front of us. There are so many people that are doing this work Palestinians have been telling us forever what they need from us, right? It's there. But first it's to undo and disrupt and dislodge the ways that these systems continue to work inside of us. If after a year and some we're still there, it's got you good. And that's the place of disruption first.
Thank you, Lara, for giving such a clear answer and an answer that I know Tarek and I were both very happy to hear. And hopefully will have been enlightening for others as well who are listening. Tarek, I'm going to hand over to you now to be able to sort of close for us, if that's okay. But thank you so much to both of you.
Yeah, I mean, all thanks to you, Michelle, for navigating such a really, really, insightful conversation between participants, your own thoughts, and Laura. That was really, really excellent. I really appreciated that. And I don't know if people could see me, but I was snapping my fingers a lot on mute, so I didn't want to disrupt the conversation. Unfortunately, we kind of have to bring it to an end. Um, the thing I think everyone should consider what they're really taking with them from this conversation. A lot of things have been said, and certainly we'll be able to think about what we're taking from this in practice. So for myself at HGL to think about, okay, what is it that we have to do? Like when we start interrogating what a safe space is, well, what would a safe space actually then really be in practice if that can be achieved? And what does that, what does solidarity, community building, all these things are like little small notes that I've taken. One of the biggest things I've taken just from this final conversation, I think just tying some of the things that were said, final point that was said was sort of this idea of an ethics of responsibility towards what we're bearing witness to necessitates will necessitate a practice of sacrifice. I mean, I think that is something that, kind of is what we're what we're dealing with, right? I think we're kind of always being pushed. There's this impulse, I think, in mental health professions to hold on to an ethics of vulnerability, and I think in a way that's what liberal Zionists want us to be captured into, like an ethics of vulnerability. Where like, hey, everyone is being hurt by this, right? And that's the kind of conversation that was being had before. And we need to resist that to go back towards an ethics of accountability and ethics of responsibility.
Mhm.
If we have an ethics of responsibility towards the earth, then that might necessitate a practice of sacrifice of how we choose to engage with it. We might not be able to extract everything that we want from the earth to satisfy our needs, right? But that's the whole point, is that responsibility will always necessitate some element of sacrifice. And for me, it begs the question, well, what am I willing to sacrifice if I want to have that sense of responsibility
Mm.
towards the people that I'm bearing witness to, towards Hind that I'm carrying in my heart? If she was my daughter, what am I willing to sacrifice for her? And I think these are the questions that I've been carrying, and I so deeply appreciate Professor Lara Sheehi, Dr. Michelle Iftikhar, the fantastic BSL interpreters that I'm now looking at you directly. Thank you so much, Petra, Sumaya. Thank you so much for coming. You know, I'm always fond of all the work that you're doing, and to everyone who's joined us tonight, thank you. Thank you for taking from your time in the evening. We're hoping that we can continue this conversation. You can find my email on our website. And if you have any thoughts about how we can continue this conversation, I'd be certainly open to hearing more about this. But as for now, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all. For anyone who's interested, there's an aftercare menu on our website. You can go there. There's some resources to help support you as we mobilize ourselves for our collective liberation. This is what we're here for, and we're hoping to continue that as we go forward. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for creating this space.
All right. I'll see you all soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.